Corruption. Before we look at the definition of corruption and discuss a few issues regarding that, let's look at an example of corruption first. Mpho worked in the Department of Human Settlements, which distribute government subsidy housing, formerly known as RDP housing. Sipho offers Mpho a brand new expensive cell phone in exchange for arranging a house for him. Mpho knows how the process of government housing works and inserts Sipho's name at the top of the register. As a result of this conduct, Sipho gets a government house, even though he did not apply for it, while other people who did apply do not get houses. Sipho occupies the house and lives in it. He gives the cell phone to Mpho for the favor which he received. Mpho and Sipho both commit corruption. With the crime of corruption, there are some general terms that you need to understand before you will be able to deal with the crime of corruption effectively. First of all, let's look at the corrupter or the giver. That is the person instigating the corrupt behavior and offering the bribe. Secondly, we have the corruptee or the recipient or the receiver. These are all synonyms. It is the person receiving the bribe and acting in a certain way because of the bribe. Then thirdly, we have the bribe itself. Now the legislation refers to this bribe as gratification. So when you read the legislation, you will see the word gratification and not the word bribe. Fourthly, the crime of corruption is created in the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act 12 of 2004. So this is a statutory crime. And then lastly, with corruption, the corrupter and the corruptee both commit crimes. These crimes are separate crimes, just like murder and culpable homicide are separate crimes. Now we will be looking at the general offense of corruption. And when you look at this slide, you will see that it is a very involved definition. And I'm going to try and break it down for you in order to make it more understandable. The first thing that we have to bear in mind is just look at what the crime of corruption involves in broad terms. Now here you'll see I've highlighted in red, and I'm going to read it like this. It says any person who directly or indirectly does something to influence another person to do something that amounts to something that is in the red box, and that person is guilty of the offense of corruption. If we go into a bit more detail, you'll see that in section 3b, we have the crime of the corrupter, and that is the person who gives or agrees or offers to give any other person any kind of gratification. The crime of the corruptee is discussed in section 3a of the legislation, and that is the person who accepts or agrees or offers to accept any gratification. Now we get to the red box, and these are all the activities that are prohibited. You'll see here in the red box, I highlighted it in pink. It says activities that amount to the illegal and dishonest and unauthorized biased conduct. It is something that deals with the misuse of information and the misuse of powers and duties. It also amounts to the abuse of a position of authority, a breach of trust, violation of a legal duty, and even designing or achieving an unjustified result or something that amounts to any other unauthorized or improper inducement to do or not to do anything. So you can see that the activities that are identified here in the legislation are all very wide. Now that we have looked at the legislation and section 3, it is much easier to understand the shortened definition of corruption. Remember that this shortened definition of corruption is not contained in the legislation itself. It is something that we simply created to make it easier for our students to understand. So let's look at the shortened definition of corruption. It says here that anyone that accepts any gratification from any other person or gives any gratification to any other person in order to act in a manner that amounts to the illegal exercise of any duties is guilty of the offense of corruption. Now we can make a few general comments regarding the crime of corruption. Corruption is a serious crime in South Africa and it erodes our entire democracy. It is a crime that is unfortunately very pervasive in our society and we have to try and deal with it as much as we can. The corruptor commits the crime created in Section 3B of the legislation, and the corruptee commits the crime created in Section 3A of the legislation. Corruption is committed when one person, the corruptor, offers any gratification or a bribe to another person, the corruptee, for doing something, and the corruptee accepts the offer and acts in a certain way as requested by the corruptor. The corruptee must simply accept the bribe and do not have to take possession of it. The corruptee does not have any ground of justification if he or she did not take possession of the bribe. Mere acceptance is enough to commit the crime. The bribe does not have to be paid to the corruptee directly, even if the bribe is paid to someone else, like the corruptee's child, and the corruptee accepts the bribe, then corruption is committed. The corruptor does not have any ground of justification if the corruptee does not do what the corruptor asked for. A mere offer is sufficient to constitute the crime of corruption. Now we look at gratification. You will remember that gratification in actual fact is the bribe that we are talking about. And the legislation talks about very specific forms of gratification. It says here in section 1, the bribe, or more technically, the gratification can be anything. The legislation stipulates gratification, in other words, a bribe in section 1 as either money, a gift, a loan, it can be property, the avoidance of a loss or the avoidance of a penalty, such as a fine, employment, a contract of employment or services, any forbearance to demand any money, any favor or advantage of any description, or any right or privilege. So you can see that the gratification can in fact be very, very wide. Then we've got another section in the legislation, and that is the failure to report corrupt acts. You'll see that section 4 of the legislation stipulates that any person in authority who knows or reasonably ought to have known that corruption is taking place should report this to a police official. Failing to do so is a crime according to the legislation. If corruption is committed outside of the Republic of South Africa by a citizen of South Africa, then a court in South Africa has the jurisdiction to decide on the matter. This is stipulated in section 35. And that is it for now. Thanks for watching.